began not with spectacle, but with loss, the quiet, irrevocable kind that hollows a life before anyone notices the echo. Her guardian's death arrived without warning, leaving behind unfinished accounts, sealed rooms, and a young woman whose future suddenly belonged to ledgers and legal hands rather than her own. Grief had scarcely found its place when duty displaced it, and mourning was reduced to a footnote in the settlement of an estate that had outlived its master. In the space where protection once stood, procedure took root, cold and exacting. She learned quickly how society treats an unguarded woman, not with open cruelty, but with polite concern sharpened by calculation. Condolences were offered with measured pauses, each one followed by questions that carried weight beneath their courtesy. How old was she, precisely? What provision had been made? Was she sensible, agreeable, manageable? Every inquiry stripped a layer of privacy from her sorrow, until grief itself felt like an inconvenience she was expected to outgrow. In drawing rooms and offices alike, her name was spoken as a problem to be solved, her future discussed as if it were an object misplaced rather than a life interrupted. The law, immaculate in its language, provided an answer. The estate, encumbered and delicate, would be settled through auction, its obligations transferred to those deemed capable of bearing them. Among these obligations was her guardianship, bound inseparably to a prospective marriage arrangement meant to secure her dowry and preserve respectability. It was not framed as a sale, nor spoken of as such, yet the distinction mattered little to the one standing at its center. She was told this was protection. She heard only the sound of choice receding. On the day the terms were announced, restraint was demanded of her as if it were a virtue owed to others. She listened while men debated figures that would decide where she slept, whose name she might one day carry, and how quietly she should accept the outcome. No one asked what she desired. Desire, she learned, was a luxury afforded to those with leverage. She possessed none. What she had instead was composure, practiced carefully, because dignity was the last possession that could not be lawfully claimed. He was present when the matter reached its conclusion, though few noticed at first. The Duke had a reputation for arriving where necessity required, and leaving before sentiment could gather. He was spoken of as reserved, untroubled by scandal, governed by an exacting sense of order that left little room for indulgence. His lands were well kept, his accounts impeccable, his name invoked when reliability was needed more than warmth. If he observed the proceedings with interest, he did so without betraying it, his attention fixed not on the figures alone, but on the silence surrounding the young woman whose fate they represented. When he spoke, it was neither dramatic nor delayed. His bid entered the record with the same precision that governed the rest of his life, and with it came a subtle shift in the room. The negotiations concluded swiftly thereafter, not because others lacked interest, but because finality had asserted itself. Assumptions followed, as they always did. Some believed him calculating, others charitable, a few quietly suspicious. None considered the possibility that restraint might conceal intent deeper than advantage. The terms he proposed were delivered privately, their clarity almost disarming. A marriage of convenience, fixed to 40 nights, no more and no less. Its purpose was administrative, not personal, to legitimize her position, resolve contested claims, and ensure she would not be passed from one arrangement to another under the guise of care. There would be no demands beyond the contract, no expectations of affection, no presumption of permanence. At its end, she would be free to decide her future, supported by provisions that restored her agency rather than replaced it. She listened without interruption, measuring his words against a lifetime of caution. Men who promised restraint often failed to practice it, yet something in his manner resisted easy dismissal. He did not persuade. He explained. He did not soften the reality. He acknowledged it. Most striking of all, he allowed silence to follow, granting her space where others had only imposed direction. It was not kindness that unsettled her, but respect, offered without ceremony and without witness. Accepting his terms felt neither triumphant nor tragic, but necessary. She agreed because survival demanded it, and because the alternative promised only further erasure. As the arrangements were set into motion, she sensed the first movement of a change she could not yet name. She was still a stranger to him, still bound by circumstance rather than sentiment, Yet something had shifted in the balance of her life. For the first time since loss had claimed her certainty, the path ahead, though narrow and uncertain, was not entirely closed. The carriage wheels struck the gravel with a sharp insistence, each tremor underfoot announcing that her life had shifted from one world into another, a transition as irrevocable as it was silent. She entered the Duke's estate with the measured steps of someone trained to survive scrutiny. Yet every polished surface and silent hallway seemed to whisper that her presence was a novelty, a temporary insertion into a life that had long been ordered without her. The grand doors closed behind her with a finality that echoed louder than any announcement. She was no longer merely an observer of her own fate. She had become its reluctant participant. The first evening was governed by protocol. Meals were taken at precise intervals, servants attending without speaking unless spoken to, and the Duke himself remained distant, seated at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his eyes calm but keenly observant. She felt as though every gesture, every lowering of her gaze, was catalogued for judgment, yet he offered no word of censure or approval. His silence, initially oppressive, gradually revealed a subtle consideration. He did not rush her, he did not crowd her, and in that restraint lay a curious form of attention, one that both unnerved and intrigued her. She had learned in grief that silence could wound as sharply as speech, yet here it was measured, protective almost, though she could not yet understand why. Days passed in a rhythm dictated by a state routine, punctuated by subtle acts that seemed insignificant until examined closely. A library key left within reach, a fire tended before she arrived in the drawing room, a chair drawn beside her when letters were read aloud. These gestures were not flamboyant, not dramatic, but they carried the weight of intention. She began to notice the way he measured words, careful not to overwhelm, the way his eyes lingered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and the rare softness in his tone when discussing matters unrelated to duty. In these small allowances, she detected a humanity beneath his formidable reputation, a hidden compass that guided him toward decency even when circumstance demanded detachment. Yet the world beyond the estate's walls remained unforgiving. Letters arrived, invitations extended, each phrased with the subtle tension of social expectation. Society speculated on the arrangement. Why had a duke, known for his cool reserve, bound himself to such a peculiar contract? Rumors drifted through drawing rooms and whispered in carriage-lined streets, some favorable, some scornful. She learned to navigate the duality of presence and invisibility, knowing that outside eyes could never measure the reality within these halls. The knowledge that she was watched, analyzed, and discussed both humbled and emboldened her. Dignity became armor, composure became defiance. The Duke observed the same world, but differently. Each inquiry, each rumor, he catalogued with precision, not because he feared society, but because he understood its relentless capacity for harm. His focus remained on her, though it was tempered by the same restraint that had guided his life for decades. He did not act on impulse. He considered consequences. Yet beneath this careful exterior, a quiet unrest began to stir. He recognized the danger in seeing her not as a ward or obligation, but as a person capable of thought, feeling, and judgment. He found himself unsettled by her courage in small things. How she insisted upon walking alone in the gardens at dusk, how she spoke to servants with a calm authority, how she asked questions that revealed a mind unwilling to be dismissed. These were not provocations. They were markers of a life refusing to be subsumed by circumstance. Conversations evolved, though never hastily. Words were chosen with care, and meaning often lingered between them, unspoken yet understood. They discussed books, estate management, and the occasional piece of news from London. The young woman, previously constrained by grief and social expectation, found herself drawn into these exchanges not by force, but by invitation. The Duke, in turn, discovered the subtle pleasure of her insight, her ability to perceive nuance where others saw only protocol. Respect, unhurried and deliberate, began to root itself between them. It was neither passion nor indulgence, but the foundational thread of what might, in time, become trust. The estate itself seemed to respond to the tension in quiet ways. Rooms once cold with rigid order felt warmer when she lingered, lights adjusted by unseen hands, Notes left in books that she alone noticed, fires kept low but steady. These intimacies were unspoken. They were not evidence of sentiment, merely acknowledgement of presence. Yet for her, these acts were proof that she was not entirely invisible, that her existence mattered even within the strict confines of duty and propriety. Each day concluded with a private reflection by candlelight, her mind replaying moments of quiet attention, gestures small but unmistakable, and a realization that perhaps the Duke's restraint concealed more than disinterest. Scandals of the heart, however muted, have a way of asserting themselves. The first hint came with a misplaced letter, intercepted and returned by a loyal servant, carrying news that a rival suitor, previously unaware of her circumstances, had expressed renewed interest. The suggestion of choice beyond the 40 knights unsettled her. She had believed her role was passive, her future contracted. That someone, unseen and external, now intruded upon the careful order of her life, reminded her sharply of the fragility of security. She could no longer assume that her dignity would remain unchallenged, nor that the terms of her temporary marriage would shield her from scrutiny entirely. In response, the Duke's attention became both more deliberate and more personal. A walk through the trimmed gardens, a shared observation of the evening sky, a momentary discussion of a book neither of them had finished. Each instance carried a subtle gravity. He did not overstep the terms of their arrangement, yet his presence was a steadying force, a reminder that within the boundaries of duty there could exist a measure of care. For her, the dichotomy of freedom constrained and attention afforded became both tantalizing and troubling. She felt the stirrings of trust, of possibility, yet understood that these could not yet be named, for fear might undo them as readily as loss had. The nights themselves offered the clearest revelations. Candlelight illuminated familiar corridors. The warmth of firelight softened shadows, and in these quiet hours, unspoken acknowledgment passed between them. A glance, a pause in conversation, a gentle correction or suggestion. These were their exchanges, measured and deliberate. In these moments, she sensed that she was being seen, not as an obligation to be managed, but as a being whose insight and courage mattered. Simultaneously, he began to recognize the weight of anticipation, the subtle shift in his own feelings, though he masked it with the same precision that had governed his life. He did not speak of it, and she did not ask, yet the tension grew palpable in its restraint. The 40 nights, once an abstract measure of duty, were no longer merely contractual. They became a landscape in which both were learning the contours of one another's character, observing limits and boundaries, and acknowledging strengths without demanding surrender. Each shared meal, each measured conversation, each cautious walk through garden paths became a thread in a growing tapestry neither had yet fully understood. The estate, once an expanse of rigid order, had begun to bend subtly under the weight of their quiet attention to one another. And yet, even in these moments of tentative understanding, the future remained uncertain. The final nights loomed, their end unavoidable, and with them, the question of what would remain when duty concluded. She had learned to navigate his attention without expectation, and he had begun to measure each gesture with a care previously unknown. What would happen when the 40 nights ended, when contract and protection dissolved, was a question that neither dared yet to voice. But both felt its approach in the hush of their exchanges, in the glances held too long, in the thoughtful pauses between words. The last evening arrived not with ceremony, but with a quiet awareness. A letter unopened on the desk, a fire low but steady, and a single glance exchanged across the drawing room spoke volumes. It was in that pause, that deliberate hesitation, that both recognized the gravity of what had unfolded. Not romance as demanded or purchased, but an unexpected emergence of trust, mutual regard, and subtle dependence. And as the candle flickered and the night deepened, she understood that the 40 nights had transformed something neither had anticipated, though the ultimate choice, and its consequences, still lay beyond the threshold, waiting to be claimed. The final dawn of the 40 nights arrived with a weight that pressed upon every corner of the estate, as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath for weeks. She awoke to the familiar chill of the morning air, the curtains drawn back just enough to let a fragile light trace the patterns of frost on the windowpane. In that stillness, She understood that the conclusion of their arrangement was imminent, that the days measured in silent glances and careful conversation were about to reach their terminus. Her chest tightened with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The world outside demanded her once more, and within the world she had come to inhabit, the Duke's presence remained steadfast yet unspoken, poised between formality and something far more perilous. He entered her morning quietly, as he had throughout their time together, though the aura of authority now carried a subtle tension. There was no ceremonial flourish, no declaration, merely the sound of polished boots on stone floor and the faint rustle of his coat. He did not approach with the airs of obligation fulfilled, but with the quiet weight of responsibility acknowledged. Every gesture, from the brief incline of his head to the steadying of the ledger he carried, seemed to signal that this day would demand a clarity neither had prepared for. For weeks, they had skirted the edges of propriety and expectation. Now, those edges threatened to cut sharply into certainty. The morning unfolded with precise economy. Letters and papers awaited signatures, each stroke a vivid reminder that the arrangement would soon dissolve into memory. Courtiers and estate stewards moved with habitual discretion, aware of the significance without understanding its full measure. Outside, the estate gardens glimmered with frost, the air sharp with winter's touch, yet inside, a warmer, subtler frost had settled in their hearts, an anticipation of choices yet unspoken, of truths yet unclaimed. Each tick of the clock marked the narrowing corridor between contract and conscience, duty and desire. She moved through the house with deliberate care, noting the quiet alterations he had made to accommodate her presence. A fire lit before her arrival, the careful placement of books she favored, a cup of tea prepared and left for her on the sideboard. These minutiae, accumulated over weeks, were not gestures of command but of attentiveness. In them lay a language neither of them had openly spoken, a measure of regard expressed without words. She felt it as both comfort and entanglement, a tether to the man who had claimed her for 40 nights, yet had never demanded more than respect. Yet respect, she realized, could carry a weight as binding as any contract, and the realization brought with it a startling clarity. The choice to remain, or to leave, was now hers in full. When they met across the hall, the air between them was taut with the gravity of inevitability. His gaze, steady and deliberate, traced the familiar lines of her face, noting its quiet strength and tempered composure. He did not speak at first, letting the silence settle over them, heavy yet intimate. In that pause, she understood that every unspoken word, every careful glance, had accumulated into a presence neither could now dismiss. The 40 nights had been measured in civility, attention, and cautious kindness. They had been measured also in the subtle awakening of possibility, a fragile recognition of what might exist beyond duty. Finally, he broke the silence with a voice low and deliberate, free of embellishment but full of intent. He spoke not of obligation fulfilled, nor of propriety maintained, but of what he had come to recognize in the quiet of shared evenings and deliberate walks. That admiration, consideration, and even affection could not be confined to timetables or legal parameters. Every word was precise, each syllable chosen to convey clarity without imposition. She listened, acutely aware of the weight behind the cadence, the careful balance between honesty and restraint. In those words, she felt the gravity of choice shift, not as a conclusion imposed, but as an invitation extended. Her own response was measured, tempered by years of learning the costs of vulnerability. She acknowledged the truth in his declaration, the recognition that the 40 nights had revealed more than either had anticipated. There was no effusion, no theatrical surrender, only the quiet assertion of agency, the decision to accept what had been offered freely rather than what had been extracted by circumstance. She spoke with the poise honed through adversity, her voice steady yet imbued with the subtle tremor of emotion carefully contained. The words carried both acknowledgment and resolution, marking the transition from contract-bound compliance to deliberate consent. The morning continued with a series of subtle rituals, each one reinforcing the shift in their dynamic. The signing of the final documents was conducted with meticulous propriety, yet each signature was underscored by the knowledge that the arrangement no longer defined the entirety of their connection. Servants moved discreetly, aware of the significance without intruding, while the Duke maintained his characteristic composure, yet in the tilt of his head, the brief catch of a breath, there were traces of an emotional resonance that had grown imperceptibly over the preceding weeks. She noted it as clearly as he noted the quiet poise she exhibited, each recognition a silent acknowledgement of mutual transformation. Outside the drawing room, the garden awaited, frosted and serene. The first snow of winter had settled lightly along the hedges, a delicate covering that softened the edges of the landscape as carefully as the past 40 nights had softened their guarded interactions. He led her with no presumption, only an unobtrusive presence that allowed her to walk freely, to breathe in the crisp air and the quiet promise of possibility. Each step through the frost-laden path was both literal and metaphorical, a journey through the landscape of understanding and respect that had taken shape in subtle increments, invisible to the unobservant eye. As the morning waned, they paused by a small fountain, its water partially frozen, yet still moving with persistent grace. He turned to her, the weight of decision clear but tempered by the acknowledgement that agency now resided fully with her. There was no demand for immediacy, no expectation beyond the careful consideration of what she wished. In that moment, the roles of guardian and ward, of duke and charge, dissolved into something less defined yet infinitely more profound. Two people bound not by legal obligation, but by recognition of shared respect and emergent affection. The 40 nights had accomplished more than the terms could dictate. They had revealed character, endurance, and the quiet capacity for choice. A carriage awaited beyond the garden gates, its driver standing at attention, the horses restless with anticipation. The symbolic weight of departure pressed upon them both, a reminder that the world beyond the estate would soon seek to reassert its scrutiny and expectations. She turned to him, her expression measured, reflecting a complex mixture of gratitude, recognition, and the nascent stirrings of something more personal. He inclined his head, silent but communicative, and in that gesture lay the promise that while duty could end, regard, once earned, need not. The final minutes before she stepped into the carriage were marked by a profound quiet, the kind that carries a weight impossible to articulate yet impossible to ignore. They exchanged no dramatic declarations, no gestures of possessive claim, only a shared acknowledgement that the time had come to act not out of contract, but out of choice. She lifted her gaze, and in the brief, sustained eye contact that followed, the culmination of 40 nights, the deliberation, restraint, and subtle awakening was fully realized. The moment stretched, charged with potential, yet unresolved, leaving both aware that the resolution was hers to grant and his to respect. The carriage door opened, and she hesitated at the threshold, caught between departure and decision, as the frost-laden morning held its breath with them both.